It's very clear that the human mind, on an innate level, is geared towards a story rather than a rigid series of facts. All people, with very few exceptions, are attracted to a story, usually a human story, a story of a character they can relate to, a story that has an arc, that builds tension, that has resolution. And sometimes the story will be the story of a victorious person, in which case it leaves you with an elated feeling that perhaps you too will win. Sometimes it's a tragic story in which hopefully it will prepare you for some of the devastating losses that any person who's lived a full life will experience. Human beings are geared to see life in terms of stories because we live out our lives in terms of stories. The way in which formal storytelling, just like it was done in the ancient primitive societies, just like it was done in the ancient advanced civilizations such as Egypt or Greece or even medieval Christendom, you have in modern society all of these different institutions in which storytelling, and oftentimes de facto cosmic storytelling, is done in order to allow a person to orient themselves to the world around them and to aspire to be like those characters. I'm talking about Hollywood, the movies. I'm talking about fiction. I'm talking about the endurance of theater into modern life. A lot of these stories, as Joseph Campbell pointed out, are geared not so much towards the ancient environment, but towards future environments, sort of space operas and various science fiction motifs. But those space operas, those science fiction stories, in many ways accomplish some of the same things that the ancient stories set out to do. They orient the person to the world, they give them a sense of what is and isn't possible, and they identify with the heroes of the stories. Joseph Campbell famously worked with George Lucas to create Star Wars, and did so in a way that self-consciously created a modern myth that would orient young people and even adults to the world of the future. I mean, this was in the 70s. And through that orientation, the young person, most likely, unless they were sociopathic, would identify with Luke Skywalker or Han Solo. And they would go through that space, that epic space story in a way that even if they themselves wouldn't ever use a lightsaber or fly from one galaxy to another, it would at least give them a sense that they too could be a hero like that, so long as they were always brave and willing to fight, and so long as they remained on the good side or the light side of the Force. A person becomes a better storyteller by telling stories, by having people to tell those stories to. One of the downsides of social media, I think, of course you have plenty of people who are making videos and telling personal stories or even grand cosmic stories. But there's a kind of disconnect there. A lot of it is strictly for the purpose of attention seeking and not for real community. I think that young boys growing up, you always see, the kids around the campfire retelling the stories of the day, what they did, what adventures they experienced, where they went, what challenges they faced, sizing each other up, who was the hero of the story, who was the villain, who won the fight, who didn't win the fight, who was scared to jump off the cliff, who wasn't. In youth, with that ritual or that custom of storytelling, as you move into the larger world, a lot of it is geared around being able to tell with detail and precision a story to another person. The legal system, a lawyer, and anyone involved in a court case is generally telling the story of an innocent man or a guilty man. Those stories, by telling stories, by having an environment in which you are invited to tell your story, you are going to become almost always a better storyteller. It exercises that muscle and it really gives expression to the instinct to be able to relate to others where you've been, where you're at, and where you're going. And of course, to be able to hear others and kind of help you to make your own stories more detailed, more precise, and hopefully more exciting. One of the central elements of the larger myths is the making of meaning, so that the Christian story from Genesis to Revelation makes meaning for all of Christian society. It gives a backdrop. For the individual person, in order to really make meaning, you have to be able to kind of tell your own little miniature part of that story. And as you get older, to really integrate all of those past experiences, all of those victories, all of those failures, and to see your own life as a story that's continuous with your own past, and a story that's continuous with your cultural past, and hopefully will be a part of that cultural future. So by learning to tell your story, or learning to tell the larger cultural myths, to relate them, it allows you to make meaning, to understand why that victory was so great, or to understand why that failure was not the end of the world. Meaning allows us not only to overcome the kinds of traumas that a failure will inflict on a person, but also in some ways to make a person, even the most victorious hero, humble as he sees that any victory that he achieves is still a tiny part of a much larger fabric. I think that overall, the ability to tell one's own story, one's family story, one's city and state and country story, one's civilization's story, it creates a psychological fabric that is basically essential for human beings to move forward in a world of obstacles and trials. A good storyteller is going to be able to attract peers and to earn the respect of peers simply by thrilling them with a story, entertaining them with a story. If it's a really heavy story, that person is really able to form bonds with other young men or other women or whatever the case may be by being able to relate, to present something that's relatable to another person and to just engage in conversation. Again, around a dinner table, sure, there are all these topics discussed, but usually the most thrilling element of dinner time conversation, at least in my opinion, is the telling of a great story. Sometimes with embellishments, sometimes the fish was quite a bit bigger, sometimes the bully was quite a bit taller, but then actually occurred in reality. But even that, those embellishments sometimes make the story itself. On a more practical level in business, just the ability to relate a situation in detail from your experience to another person who's not had the experience but maybe can gain insights from it, it's an important part of business relationships, in the legal system. The ability to explain the situation of a defendant or a plaintiff is going to sway a jury in order to see the outcomes of some of the most consequential decisions made, that those of the judge upon a person's freedom or imprisonment. In politics, telling stories is always the thing that grabs the audience. Sometimes the politician tells some portion of the grand national story. By being able to tell your story in an honest way, in an environment that you can trust those people are not out to hurt you or use that story against you, you really are able to realize yourself in a way that isn't possible in any other fashion. And I think that learning those deep storytelling skills, everything from just impressing your buddies with the tale of some adventure to perhaps the more practical arena of politics or the legal system, and to the deepest and most important communities that we have, religious and spiritual communities, you're able to bring meaning to the events of your life and hopefully attach that meaning to some larger story, some larger sense of meaning that the other people that you're speaking to, telling your story to, also share.